So good morning, everyone, or good evening, everyone, in Mariupol, Ukraine. Welcome to part 4 of American history. Last time we did part 3, and now we are part 4 in the middle of our American history lecture series. I hope you are all doing okay. I know that you are still in quarantine, it's been extended. I am also in quarantine too, but hey, at least we can maybe learn something. So, all is not terrible, all is not unfortunate. And today, we're kind of going back a little bit in history. Last week, we did about the Civil War, but we're going to go a little bit backwards to cover some of the early immigration and industrialization that was happening in America. And then we'll move past the Civil War and talk about a little bit of World War I and the Great Depression, which unfortunately is a little bit relevant today because America is struggling right now economically due to COVID-19. They're not the same thing, but we are having some economic difficulties. So maybe we'll try to learn something from the past. I have here on my first slide of our American history. It's not a very famous image, but it's kind of very famous idea in America. We have a photograph of immigrants arriving in New York Harbor in New York City in 1900s. This is kind of at the apex of the first major wave of immigration in America. And I think, to be honest, it's maybe a romanticized a little bit. We often think of, oh, Americans or when immigrants came to America, they were very happy, they were smiling. And to some extent, many were. They were fleeing oppression, they were fleeing violence. Some just wanted to make money and then go back home. But some of them were happy, but others also just were maybe not happy, or they were just there to, try something new. Unfortunately, the 19th century and even the 20th century saw a lot of upheaval, a lot of changes around the world, especially in Europe. And many European immigrants, both from Western Europe, but especially in Central and Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, came to America during this time period. The largest groups being Italians, Russian or Russian Empire citizens, so to speak, um, as well as a lot of American or a lot of Jews came to America, a lot of Italians, as I said, Germans, Irish, even Chinese. So we're starting to have the melting pot that everybody associates with America. It's not to say we never had it before, but we generally tended to have immigrants in America who came from the same region. And now we're starting to expand and have different groups of people. But this is a just kind of a quintessential image, I think, of people that, especially even Americans, have of immigrants arriving to American shores. They see the Statue of Liberty and they wave to her because she is the first thing that they see when they arrive in America, kind of the symbolism of freedom, and that's why many people did come to America and still are coming, actually. America is actually right now, we are still in we're in our largest period of immigration in history. And I'll show you that later too. We tend to think of the early 1900s as loss of immigrants, but actually we're having more immigrants now. Oh, excuse me. So let me, just to recap a little bit of what we learned last lecture. So, our main lecture topic was the Civil War and what happened after the Civil War. We had a Civil War to decide whether we were going to have slavery or not in our growing country. We're having massive growth out west, even south and north, and we have to decide, are those states going to have slavery or not? And it honestly becomes very bloody, and we have a massive war, probably the most influential war in American history besides the World War II. And even though we ended the war, we finally got back together as a country. We united, and we ended slavery. We didn't, unfortunately, end racism. In fact, racism, I would even say, became stronger. It became more violent for sure, and it became much more visible and acceptable in public places. That's what made it so difficult. We had the 13th Amendment, but we had also some strange idea of how you could have separate but equal policies in America. And we have black codes to allow these policies. And this whole entire period that we call, kind of the growth of racism or visible racism is our Jim Crow period. And it lasts really for 100 years, up until the civil rights movement, really. And as a result of Jim Crow, as a result of this growing backlash, as I said last lecture, we have a huge great migration of Black Americans moving to northeastern cities, even to the Midwest. They're moving, they're trying to make their lives better. The South, unfortunately, is not making their lives easier. And this is important because there's starting to be a growing Black identity, and more importantly, a growing Black organization in terms of organizing for their freedoms, organizing for cultural purposes, for arts, uh, for education, even. So, this is, in the midst of this awful, terrible period of racism, or really strong racism, we've always had racism. We do have some bright spots, especially with the Great Migration and the birth of the Black Renaissance, as we say, when Black culture really just thrived in America in the early 1900s. But to go back to immigration, and that's where I'm beginning my lecture today, I have to go back actually to the beginning of America, because obviously America was founded on immigration. In fact, even the Native Americans who were here before any Europeans arrived, they also migrated. They came from what was originally called Beringia here on the right hand corner. And it was the landmass that was connected to present day Siberia and Alaska. So, this whole, I mean, the world is a history of migration, but I think America and the New World, or the North American continent, really emphasized that. Um, and the very first of these migrants that came around 40,000 to 25,000 BCE, or years ago. They came a very long time ago. So, Native Americans, first peoples in America, have been here for a very, very long time. And that's something that we still have to respect in America. But the very first Europeans that start to come in America is in the 15th century, most famously with explorers like Columbus and Cortez. But the first Europeans to settle in America, as we recalled in our very first lecture, was in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. And of course, they came for many reasons. They wanted economic opportunities, they just wanted to strike it rich. Some people came for religious freedom. Some people just wanted second chances. In Europe, they had the primogenitor rule, which is where the oldest son takes the entire inheritance and gets the majority of wealth. So, what happens to all the daughters and sons below them, below that oldest son? And some people, believe it or not, people forget this maybe, at least in America. Some people came to America because they had to serve a prison sentence. This was actually parts of American colonies like Georgia were penal colonies. Instead of going to jail, which were overcrowded in England, England said, well, you can either, rot and die in this jail, or you can go to America and serve your sentence and stay there. So and it's interesting. We're kind of a nation also of convicts. And also, we have a huge number of immigrants that come are indentured servants. We have slaves, of course, but we also have indentured servants. And that's how the majority of immigrants, especially European immigrants, came to America in the beginning. They did a contract where for a ticket to America, they would serve a period of time. Now, this was not by any means easy. They were treated terrible, but eventually they could be free. And of course, as I said, slaves. Slaves were another large, massive group of immigrants. They're a very special category because typically, honestly, when we think of immigration, we think of someone choosing to come to another country, choosing to leave their old life, choosing to make their life better. Here, slaves did never had the choice. They were forced into this immigration, this migration. So that's important to note. And it's estimated that over 500,000 Africans were forcibly moved from Africa to America until 1807, when officially we ended the slave trade. But of course, there was also, illegal trading going on too. So I just want to emphasize, America was always had immigrants. And I know maybe some of you are wondering, then why do you talk negatively about why do some Americans maybe dislike immigrants or want to close the borders, put stronger immigration laws? It's a very tricky situation, honestly, to explain. Um, and maybe towards the end of the lecture, I'll address it. So one of the reasons, one important thing about immigration in terms of these Europeans coming to America, it was actually encouraged that Europeans come to America, in part because there's this ideology by a man named John Locke, who's a very famous British philosopher. He really espoused or advocated for the view that the new world, the new lands needed to be cultivated, needed to be controlled and owned by Europeans, because only Europeans really understood ownership. Um, to have actual ownership or land, to claim that a land is yours, you have to cultivate it and settle it. That was John Locke's definition of what is ownership. So he and many other Europeans didn't consider Native Americans to really own the land in the New World because they were nomadic, they were communal. They didn't really own land, they shared it with each other, they moved from area to area. And this was very important because this is one of the very early justifications for being able to migrate and to settle in the New World. It's a little bit unfair, obviously. It's a very racist ideology to think that ownership has to be when Europeans cultivate it and settle it, and Native Americans naturally don't do that, so they can't own it. It's a messed up way to justify removing them from their lands or taking their lands. But a lot of Europeans, especially who came to America, believe this. And this has, I think, even repercussions today. This idea that, well, I'm sorry, Native Americans, you just didn't have the proper technology. We're the superior force, superior race. Unfortunately, there are people I think who still kind of think that today, especially in the middle of the 1800s, which we'll cover. Something about immigration, too, is actually that may shock you is the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution, who drafted it, they were actually very unclear and vague about immigration. They actually generally believed that immigration should not be restricted. So they didn't put a lot of laws to restrict it, to put, to make it clear, say, this is who and who cannot immigrate. They generally wanted America to be open to immigrants. However, there does start to be in the 1700s, late 1700s, when the Constitution is already written, there starts to be restrictions on who could be a citizen. So obviously, when you come to America, even today, you're not automatically a citizen. There are actually laws in place for how you have to become a citizen. And in fact, generally, you have to be, first of all, you have to have a proper visa. And then you have to live in the United States as a permanent resident for 5 years, meaning you actually live in America, you develop your culture and your home in America. You don't just take vacations to America. So you're a permanent resident for 5 years, and then you can apply for citizenship, but you have to pass the test. And I say this as someone who had to help people pass that test. That's what I did in my past life actually a year ago now. Um, so anyway, we start to have restrictions on who could be a citizen. Um, and unfortunately, that was kind of, it wasn't for very good reasons. Even though they didn't want to restrict immigration, they believed that citizenship should first and foremost go to white people only, especially those who are land owning. Wasn't even necessarily race based. It was just wealth based. Like, are you white? Do you own a lot of land? Are you a good citizen, an upstanding Christian? So, not everyone could be a citizen. And even the US president and vice president had to be natural born citizens. And this is still law today. Immigrants cannot be president or vice president in America. They can be senators, they can be representatives in our Congress, but they can't hold the highest positions in office. And part of that is just to make sure that someone's background doesn't influence their policy or their decision making in government. And I understand this. I'm actually not really against it. um, and I personally never want to be president of America, so it's fine by me. um, so we have our new settlement. We have Europeans coming from all walks of life. And from the 17th century to the late 18th century, so the 1600s to the 1700s, most of the immigrants to America were from, I had to say present day, because I know in Europe back then was very different from what it is today. Most of them came from Germany, from England, France, the Netherlands. I forget this sometimes, but the Netherlands were very big in New York. It's why Manhattan is called Manhattan. It's a Dutch word, and actually New York used to be called New Holland, I believe. So Ireland, of course, but this wave of Irish immigrants, just so you know, were mostly Protestant Irish. They weren't Catholic Irish. And that's a very big difference because the Catholic Irish came in the 1900s and the late and the middle of 1800s, but they were Catholic, so there's a lot of racism towards them for that. Um, People were very scared of Catholics at this time because their authority wasn't to a government or a monarch, even, it was to the Pope. So there was a lot of fear of that. Scottish, again, and many of these Scottish and Scots Irish are Protestant. And of course, African nations, people who were forced to come to America. And this is just a picture, just so you know, by 1760, this is kind of like what America looks like with its immigrant populations. So it's pretty diverse, but as you can see, the majority, or maybe even half of the people, come from England. The green right here is the British, or I should say the English, excuse me. So, and here is also immigration in the early stages of America, was slow. But once you start to reach 1760, you start to have even more and more immigration. So it's a steady peak. It takes a while, and it's really predominantly in the southern colonies, but you also have it in New England, north here, as well as the middle colonies. Um, and again, I think this red line for total, a lot of that also has to do with Africans coming to America. Now, I just want to mention too, as I said before, with the growth of European settlement and immigration, um, and especially in the 1800s, as America expands and new immigrants arrive, unfortunately, Native Americans, they have to confront them. They have to confront with these new settlers. Some of them move, some of them by choice or by force, they move even more westward. Some Native Americans fight back, rightfully so. And of course, as I said, some are forced to move, and later they're forced to move to reservations. And then some Native Americans make treaties or deals with with the American government. But to be quite frank with you, the American government generally doesn't honor the treaties. It breaks them. It doesn't follow them. And even when it does try to follow the treaties, the actual people who want to settle in Native American lands don't care. The actual American settlers don't care about the treaties. Maybe the government does. Maybe the Native American nation does, but the people themselves don't care, the settlers. It's a big problem. And this is really starting to happen in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This forced removal, as we talked about in lecture 2, we have the Trail of Tears, Andrew Jackson forcing Native Americans to go west from Georgia. And reservations, just so you know, are very large tracts or areas of land for Native Americans. And this map right here shows you where present day reservations are. As you can see, many of them are in the West. The majority are in this area. which, and to be quite frank, they're here because it's mostly deserted land. It's dry land, and it's actually really terrible land. It's very difficult to farm, to thrive in these areas. I mean, you can, but it's difficult. This is where the fertile soil is. So, quite frankly, Native Americans got ripped off on these reservations. Um, and to be honest, that was the goal of the United States government, and a big part of it was they put them on these areas of land to try to keep control of Native Americans. Um, they might say for their, and in part they would say, the American government would say it's for their protection, because actually a lot of settlers wanted to kill Native Americans and they fought them and were violent. So this was a way of maybe trying to protect Native Americans. It was also a way to encourage their assimilation into American culture. A lot of these reservations were now controlled by the US government. So now they had to abide by American laws, American standards, and even American schools. There were schools put in place on these reservations where Native Americans had to attend. They weren't nice. They tried to, Europeanize Native Americans, convert them to Christianity against their will. Um, so this is not a pretty history. As I always said, American history is good, bad, and ugly. This is an ugly part of American history, reservations. And today, we still have reservations. They aren't what they were early 1900s. Native Americans have much more rights to control and do what they like in their reservations, but they are economically generally poor. They're generally struggling, to be honest. There's a high rate of drugs, of alcohol use. There's also a high rate of sexual assault in the reservations. So, and right now there's over 300 reservations in America, but there are actually 570 federally recognized tribes. So not every tribe has a reservation. And the largest one is the Navajo Nation. This is a picture of it in Arizona. So this is what it looks like from the highway, the street. This is their flag. I think it's very beautiful, actually. Um, and then this is actually where it is. This is the large area that is the Navajo Nation. And to be honest, I don't know quite well all the differences between reservations and especially Native American reservation law compared to federal law. It's always been kind of a balance of a relationship between the US government and reservations, because reservations, they are part of the U.S. government. The U.S. government oversees them, but they are largely controlled and settled by Native Americans. So there's a fine balance there. It's hard for our country to sometimes honor that balance. And right now, actually, unfortunately, the Navajo Nation has a very large spread of COVID-19 cases. And I've heard that they actually haven't received a lot of help from the federal government. And part of this is because they're not a state. The reservations aren't a state. They aren't really a city. They're a very special territory for Native Americans. So they don't fall within the same laws and guidelines as states who are receiving COVID-19 help. So it's also, this never goes away. But to move on from the mass migration that we had or the migration that we had from the 1600s and 1800s, immigrants steadily came to America. As you see in that map before, it starts to peak at 1760 right here. And really, it's in the middle of the 1800s that we see the first wave of mass migration in America, where it's an incredible amount of people. It's almost just as much as the domestic population already. And the two biggest groups that come in the first wave of immigrants are the Irish, specifically Catholic Irish, and German immigrants. And for those who may or may not know, Ireland has a big problem in the 1800s, middle of the 1800s. They have a huge potato famine. And a lot of Irish, especially poor Irish, relied on the potato, and they had a huge famine of potatoes. I think the potato had a disease. They couldn't eat it. and the population just absolutely declines. This is a map of, excuse me, of their population. And, in some places, you have 25 to 30% of the population dying or decreasing. It's a massive problem. Um, the one exception is Dublin. I'm not sure why. So it's a big problem, and many Irish, as a result, move to America. They try to get their luck within America, and many of them are Catholic Irish, which is important. Um, Also, Germans come to America. I mean, Germans have always come to America since America was founded, but you start to have a massive wave of them in this period because during the middle of the 1800s, Germany is having a lot of wars. Germany isn't really even Germany, it's these different states. It's part of Prussia, it's part of Bavaria. It has a lot of civil unrest, revolutions. So a lot of people flee. And between just in a period of 50 years, from 1820 to 1870, we have over 7.5 million immigrants coming to America. And they're mostly from Northern and Western Europe. Later on in the 1900s, early 1900s, they come from Eastern and Southern Europe. In 1810, just to put in a comparison, America's population alone was 7 million. So, it's crazy. We almost double our population just through immigration alone. Um, and as I said, Ireland experienced a horrible famine, and Germany was witnessing a lot of wars. And one of the unfortunately, with any historical period or events, you're always going to have usually a negative reaction or some sort of reaction. And because of the large wave of Irish and German immigrants, along with other groups of people, we have a very strong rise in nativism and anti immigration feeling. There's a lot of Americans who are like panicking, like, oh my God, these people, who are they? They're Catholic. They follow this man who is a pope. Germans, oh, they're also Catholic. A lot of German Catholics come too. They speak a foreign language. Their religion is weird. They're not the typical Protestants that we like. They're not the typical British that we like or European. Um, and a lot of these Germans that are Irish were seen as dirty, kind of gruff, kind of ugly. This is a cartoon of, it was an anti Irish political cartoon. And here is the British woman kind of begging for forgiveness. And here is the Irish woman. As you can see, there's a dramatic contrast between the two women. You have the civilized and nicely tailored, sophisticated looking British woman or English woman, and then you have the kind of brute, heavy set Irish woman. Um, Obviously, this is a satirical cartoon, but it's not satirical in terms of the people's feelings. A lot of people had anti-Irish feelings. Um, they were just fearful, they had xenophobia, and they really almost felt like, and what I mean by nativism, just so you know, in this slide, and nativism even today, it's generally the fear. It's not just anti-immigration feeling. It's something even deeper than that. It's a fear that if you let a certain group of people come into your country, then they're taking away what was precious to your country or what was sacred in your country. Oh, and a lot of people, in the history of American history, people have a fear that some of these waves of immigrants are changing not only the look of the American people, they're darker skinned, but they're also changing the values of America. And people have fear of that. And to be honest, I think people still have a fear of that today. Our president has made comments, quite frankly, where he prefers Europeans from Northern Europe and probably from Western Europe because he likes the idea that they're white, that they're educated, that they're wealthy. Still today, many of our immigrants come from Central and South America. They tend to be poor. They tend to not have the highest level of education. That's one of the reasons why they come to America. But there are honestly Americans who would prefer that they did not come. Anyway, So we started to have massive waves of immigration. It's becoming actually a big issue. The US has to do something about it. And we start to have more immigration laws. And we start to now have a different processing system. And something that's very symbolic of that is Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. Um, so the US, because of the large numbers of immigrants coming to the US, especially through New York City was the number one entrance to America for immigrants. The U.S. opens an immigration processing area called Ellis Island, and this is actually present day Ellis Island. This is what it looks like now. It's a museum. It's really wonderful. If you ever get to go to New York, I recommend visiting it. And as you can see, it's right next to the Statue of Liberty. So Ellis Island opens up in 1892, and it's situated next to the Statue of Liberty. And the Statue of Liberty is interesting too. It was actually a gift from France in honor of America's independence bicentennial. So the Statue of Liberty was supposed to open up in 1876, but oh, I shouldn't say bicentennial. I should say centennial. Excuse me. I have a typo, guys. But anyway, the Statue of Liberty was a gift in honor of America's independence. And unfortunately, though, it took a lot of time to raise the money to build it and to build the bottom, the base for the monument. So the statue actually did not open up until October 1886. But it was still a really incredible gift. She is probably the most famous statue monument in America today. It is the equivalent of our Eiffel Tower, our I don't know, Buckingham Palace gates. So very important statue. Um, and 6 years later, after the Statue of Liberty opens up, we have Ellis Island. So the two are kind of next to each other and symbolic. And she's also a very symbolic figure because I didn't show you it, but she holds a flame, kind of like a lighthouse. So she's kind of being a guide to the immigrants, like you have come on shore, and she, kind of has her arms open. So she's kind of welcoming them. And Ellis Island was a very important area or center for immigration. Over 12 million immigrants from 1892 to 1954 were processed on Ellis Island alone. So that's a massive amount of people to go through one area, one entire little build. It's not even little, but building. Um, and at the peak of its operation, some 5,000 to 10,000 people pass through every day. That's incredible, especially for that time period. So, and actually, I have to say this: my mom's family came through Ellis Island. They were from southern Italy, from Naples area. Um, I'm not sure exactly why they left. They didn't have a diary, but I'm sure it's like for many reasons why a lot of Southern Italians came to America, especially in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and a lot of it I think had to do with economic opportunity. Italy was going through some economic depressions during this time period. It was actually, if you remember, a nation of many kingdoms, so there was a lot of fighting. It had different problems. And then my mom's family came during this time period, and I know they went through Ellis Island because we visited Ellis Island and we found their records. So that's cool. My dad's family, we're not sure. We know that they were from Germany. Maybe they came during the 1860s when all the other Germans came. We're not sure. My dad never did one of those investigations, but oh well, some people know where their family came from and how, others don't. It's okay. It's just what it is. And I do want to just share with you this poem. It's a very famous one, and it became kind of popular in the news because it was used in reference to Donald Trump's. He started to have travel bans for certain immigrant groups, particularly from Africa, parts of Africa. Um, and some people were like, this is the antithesis of what America should be. Let's look at the new Colossus. This was a poem written by Emma Lazarus, who herself was an immigrant. I think from the Russian Empire, actually. She was Jewish. She was a Russian Jew. And she wrote this poem actually to help raise funds to have the Statue of Liberty built. So, and this entire poem is actually about the Statue of Liberty. She wrote it in honor of the statue. And her most famous line, and this is the one that's quoted a lot of times. I like it. I think it's very beautiful. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So this is almost, she's speaking through the perspective of Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty. And she, I like it. It's very beautiful because it's not telling me, give me your educated, give me your rich, give me your white people. It's give me your tired, your poor. Give me the people who want to breathe free, who want freedom. People who are maybe wretched, have been, dumped on the sidewalk, who have been ignored by their country. And they've been, battered, and they've crossed the ocean, tempest tossed. The ocean has, scattered them. Bring them to me, send them to me. I welcome them. And I think it's a very beautiful poem. And I like to be reminded of it because I think this is what America personally should stand for. I don't think we should ever forget this poem. And I don't think that not every American who wants strong immigration laws is anti-immigration. People want to make sure that people who come to our country, have good background records in terms of they haven't committed criminal activities, that they aren't sketchy, that they're not part of the mafia or something like that, that they are coming for good reasons. They want opportunity. They're not coming to America to do wrong or to do evil acts. But honestly, again, I don't think many immigrants who come to America are coming for that reason. I think many are just wanting, a second chance. They're trying just to make a better life for their family. So it's a good reminder. And this is what she looked like. This is a sketch of Emma Lazarus. So in the midst of this immigration wave, we also have a massive wave of industry. And our industrial revolution, it begins a little bit later than England. England starts to have it in the 18th century, pre-Victorian. And we start to have it in the Victorian era. We start to have it in the 19th century. We're a little bit behind, but we do catch up. And it starts slowly, though. Our industrial revolution, it's not just a big explosion, that happens. It's slow. Many little things have to happen for it to really occur, for industry to take hold in America. And it starts with kind of the turning point is when the first mill is built in America in 1790. This was I believe it was a cotton mill even. It was a mill to process cotton faster. It was kind of like the first machine process that came to America. And a gentleman, Samuel Slater, opened it, I believe, in 1790. But to be honest, it's not really, it takes another 80 years for America to really see industry grow. Again, as I said, it's small steps. So we have small mills, we have small factories that start to open up. And one of the most famous one is in Lowell, Massachusetts. I might be pronouncing it wrong because they might pronounce it differently in Massachusetts, but I'm going to say Lowell, Massachusetts. It opened up in 1823, and this is actually a picture of it right here. And as you notice, it looks like a typical factory. It's an assembly line. It's for textile. They're making wool and not wool, excuse me, yarn, thread. And as you notice too, it's full of women. And actually, women were really sought after by factory owners for two main reasons. They had small, thinner hands than men, so that they could, kind of pick easier at the machines. They could fit their hands through machines. It's another reason why later children are recruited to work in the factories because they have small, thinner hands than men. Another reason why women were common in factories during this time period too is because they were cheaper. You don't have to pay women the same wage as a man. And even though that's illegal now in America, it still happens, to be quite frank. Equal pay has always been an issue in our country, and it really starts to show in the beginnings of our industry. So, but this was one of the first famous factories to open in America in 1823. And this is what it looks like, you know? um, and why one of the reasons why it's kind of slow to move the industrial revolution is um, people were very skeptical at first to give loans and credit, especially banks. um, and first of all, we didn't have that many banks in the 1700s, not like we do today. And in fact, Alexander Hamilton, when he was writing his Federalist Papers, when he was writing his many works, he wanted a national bank. He advocated for a bank. He really believed that America needs to have some sort of creditor or some sort of financial institution to take hold of its finances. There wasn't really any. Um, and so we finally get a national bank in 1790, and this was good because it provides a line of credit for businesses. We didn't have a lot of small banks at this time. Small banks come later, and actually, even though the national bank didn't last forever, we actually got rid of it. A lot of people in America didn't like it; they thought it would be too powerful. It was too much of an example of big government becoming powerful, you know. But luckily, when the national bank did fail, when it closed down, a lot of state banks actually opened up, which is good because anytime you have a bank, you have hopefully a line of credit. And this is very good for businesses. This is what you need to first open up a factory, a business, a mill. You need that line of credit, that loan to get you going. So, and eventually, state governments who can profit from these loans because you charge interest, right? State governments are starting to become very open and eager to provide credit, to provide loans because they make interest. It's a good revenue source for them. And this is how we start to have states supporting businesses to grow. And this is where we get the tide moving to have our industry open. And I just want to point out to you this picture. This is actually this is a statue of Alexander Hamilton himself. Well, not himself, it's a statue of him. But this is a statue of Hamilton, and he's in front of the Department of Treasury, which is not our national bank, but it is our big financial institution that helps banks, that helps to create our currency, regulate it, gives financial, directives and policies. Right now, you're hearing a lot about the Treasury with COVID. So he's very symbolic because uh, he's very symbolic to have in front of the Treasury Department because he was such a big advocate for it, for having a national institution to help America grow financially. So we're starting our movement. Um, and before I move on, I did want to add this too. And you can even pause in this video to look at this. Um, Along with our industries, as I said, we have immigration. And I found this chart. I think it's very good. It shows actually in different colors the different nations where immigrants came from, and it shows the amount that came from 0 to 10 million. So we have, as you can see, actually our second biggest wave of immigration right now. But we had, starting in the 1850s, large groups of people. Here we have Germany and we have Ireland coming, but we also have people from Europe still coming. And then, it just grows and grows and grows. And here, just so you all notice, it says Russia. What it really means is the Russian Empire. This is when many Central Europeans, Eastern Europeans came to America. The largest group being Jews, Russian Jews. So this is where a lot of Russians come in the early 1900s. And Italy is also a very big country, and this is when they come. This is a big period. So this is a nice graph. You can just see how we have waves of immigration, literally. It starts to slow down because of the Great Depression, actually, but then it grows again after World War II. And now we are in our biggest one. And as you can see, our largest immigrant group is mainly Mexico. We also have the Caribbean. We also continue to have Chinese immigrants and other Asian immigrants too. So the colors change. I like this graphic because it kind of shows a melting of groups, the blending of the colors and the nations. So I recommend, if you want to keep looking at this, just to pause the video. It's nice. It's pretty. So, along with our waves of industry and also our waves of immigration, we have this burgeoning new technologies. We start to have this period of like new ideas, new technologies that we're open to. And it is coming a lot from the Northeast. So, unlike the South and unlike the West, which has a lot of land to settle and to grow, the Northeast is actually kind of crowded, doesn't have a lot of land. So it's going to focus more for its economy and its economic wealth in technologies and industries. So we have some very important technologies and industries that happen and occur. As I said, in 1790, we have our first factory in America, which is a cotton spinning mill. Um, and that happens in 1790. And then a couple years later, Eli Whitney, who I mentioned in lecture 2, he created the cotton gin. He created in 1792, which was very big for processing cotton. And in fact, it increased the slave labor too. But then 6 years later, he actually, I didn't even know this, he designed guns that could use interchangeable parts. And this doesn't sound like a very big idea. Okay, it's just a gun. But first of all, guns were very popular in America back then. They were needed. And to be honest, they're still popular today. But guns at that time had to be handcrafted, piece by piece. Here, he's making kind of like a factory system where if you just create 100 pieces of this part, 100 pieces of that part, you can assemble them and create a factory line to create guns. And even though his design was only for guns, it's a very big idea in terms of manufacturing. The idea that you use interchangeable parts like a factory assembly line to create a product. This was absolutely instrumental. And we don't really see it till 100 years later with something like the Model T car by Henry Ford, which used interchangeable parts and an assembly line built. But he's kind of the first to really think about this. Another gentleman who we have to focus on is Oliver Evans, whom I never heard of, but he's very important. In 1804, he built the first high-powered steam engine. And maybe you're wondering, what is the big deal about this? I mean, I thought so. But the steam engine was very important because it was adaptable for many machines and it made machines go faster. It was incredible. And you could put these steam engines in boats, in mill factories, in trains, and even in printing presses. So now things are moving much faster. So you're going to be able to travel faster, produce faster, move faster, print faster. This is just, it gets the cycle rolling. It gets the ball rolling, as we say. Another big technological changes were actually in agriculture too. Cyrus Mccormick, and he's famous because now we have a brand of spices and herbs from his factory, McCormick Spices and Herbs, that are still used today. Cyrus McCormick invents a harvesting grain that that's used by a horse. A horse draws. It's a horse-drawn reaper, so it harvests the grain differently than like a typical man-made reaper. So it can move faster. It can harvest grain faster. It's actually was a big machine with wheels. And instead of having individuals harvesting grain, you can now do it much quicker with one person. Again, also John Deere makes harvesting easier, except he doesn't do harvesting. He does the turning of the soil much easier. So turning and moving farmland and soil to create a new harvest. He makes it much easier by creating a riding plow. And we can see it right here. That's also horse drawn and can be used by one person. So instead of having individuals harvesting grain, moving the soil, you now can go much faster with this technology. So this is big for agriculture. Another big thing was the invention of the telegraph and Morse code. This was by Samuel Morse. Very, very revolutionary. And later we have the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell. And then we have the radio. So all these new technologies are happening. They're starting to be created in the 1800s, early 1800s, but they're all instrumental in helping our America to grow as an industry, and to ease many American lives. Along with new technologies, we also have what I call new unions. And the two biggest things that happened, I would say, are the growth and creation of canals. These are waterways that are created, man-made waterways that are created to help move goods from one area to another. So the Erie Canal was actually it's the most famous canal. Now canals are everywhere. We have one in New Orleans too. But the Erie Canal was the first. It was man-made project, and it was a canal, a waterway that went from Albany, New York to Buffalo, New York. It happened in 1840, and it was considered to be by historians the first great transportation project by America in terms of man-made transportation. And it was a really big deal because Albany is connected to the Hudson River right here. And the Hudson River, for those who don't know or may not know, it goes down to New York City. The Hudson River is really big, and it crosses New York, and it goes all the way to New York City. And so they built a canal that connected Albany on the Hudson to the lakes. And as you can see here, these lakes are part of Canada and Northern America. So this is really important. So now you can move goods from the Atlantic coast in New York City to Canada and the Midwest. You can transport. So it was a huge undertaking. I think it took like 20 years, but it was a very big deal. And as you can see, some of the famous cities in New York, like Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, they all opened along the canal. It's a very important moment in New York history and American history. So this is just one example of how we start to have this unification in our country. From one area to another, we're starting to make it easier for transportation and industry to grow. Another big thing, and probably the biggest thing that happened in the 1800s for industry, is the railroad. Unfortunately, now our railroad system isn't as great as it was, and it could use some modernization, I think. But anyway, the railroads were vital to the transportation and connection of goods and people. It's obviously vital in Ukraine. It was vital in America, I can tell you that. And a big moment happened in American history in 1869 when the two major railroad companies, I don't know their names, but they're very important. The two railroad companies that connected from west to east and east to west, they met in actually Utah. They met in Utah in 1869 around here, and they connected their railroad lines. And now you actually have, and this is actually a map, you have a complete connection of a railroad from one coast in America to another. So you can really say that America is now connected. And I read that this is actually the first transcontinental railroad ever to be built, in terms of one part of a continent or a country is connected to another. It was a massive undertaking, but very important. And you can see how railroads were very important, especially in the East Coast. These are all the major railroad lines. They're going from the East Coast to the Midwest. And so now you have this other railroad line that connects the East Coast to the West Coast. So this just makes it easier to transport goods, but also for immigrants and Americans to settle. And something I have to mention is that the railroads were built predominantly by Irish and Chinese immigrants. A lot of them died. A lot of them were mistreated, to be quite frank. but they were the ones who laid down a lot of these railroads. Um, and why was it the Chinese and the Irish? Well, because they were immigrants. You didn't have to pay them as well. They didn't have rights. You could pay a very low wage to them. Um, and quite frankly, they were willing to do the job. They needed a job. It was their only opportunity. There was a lot of discrimination against the Irish and the Chinese during this time. So, I just want to emphasize the difference in railroad tracks. In terms of the amount. In 1850, America had 14,500 kilometers of railroad tracks. And 50 years later, in 50 years, we would increase that number to 320,000 kilometers. That's ginormous. That's incredible. I can't even fathom that. So we really expand. And of course, with the railroads, a lot of people become rich, especially Cornelius Vanderbilt. So anyway, we have this birth in industry. We have these waves of immigration. And one of the reasons why we have this support and movement for the West, but also for railroads and transportation, we have this idea of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is actually a term. It was coined or, created by a man named John O'Sullivan in 1845. He was actually writing about how the British were kind of encroaching on the Oregon Territory, how the British weren't liking the Americans going into Oregon and settling. We have to remember, Oregon at this time is not a state. It's part of British territory, actually. But anyway, he's, kind of lamenting like the British aren't being nice. And he says, you know what? America has a manifest destiny. It has, throughout its history, been granted almost by God to settle this new world. And maybe some of you are laughing or thinking, what? But there was actually, since the days of early America, a belief by many Americans that somehow America was special and it was kind of blessed by God because it has such good riches and people and industry and wealth. It's somehow blessed by God to expand. And there was this belief that America needed to carry out its ideas, its religion, predominantly Christianity. It needed to spread this idea, this ideology from the East Coast to the West Coast. It had a mission from God almost to spread its ideas. And maybe it sounds a little silly, I don't know. But it doesn't matter. It's very influential. I think, to be honest, even today, a lot of Americans believe that America has a duty to spread its ideas of democracy, freedom, and liberty to other nations. Sometimes this is done well. Sometimes this is not done so well. We've invaded other countries because we believe so strongly in our ideas. And sometimes those invasions have not gone well. But anyway, it's a very important mentality, and it's one of the driving forces for this expansion into the West, and just in general to the north, to the northeast, to the northwest, Midwest. There's just this abundant belief among Americans that America is destined to grow. America is destined to, put God's work into being. And unfortunately, though, I have to say, this mentality, it's always present, and sometimes it manifests itself into feelings of cultural and racial superiority. This is one of the reasons why Europeans were okay with kind of moving and killing Native Americans. Well, you know what? You're racially inferior. You're culturally inferior. So we can settle your land. We can kill you. We can take over you. It's not always a good thing, this manifest destiny. And President Theodore Roosevelt later carried this idea of kind of like expanding American liberty and ideas to the world. He had a famous phrase in foreign and domestic policy: speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far. It was kind of this idea that America would allow other nations to be, but it would have a presence, it would have a voice. It wasn't just going to let other nations do whatever they would want. They were, America was going to be more vocal, and at times it was going to intervene. And President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, believed in this, especially in Latin America. He believed that Latin America was really kind of the area that America should take care of, not Europe. At this time, Europe is still involved in Latin America, especially the Spanish. And Theodore Roosevelt believed that the Spanish should, get out, that they should leave and kind of let Latin America grow and let America take care of it. So, anyway, that's a picture of Theodore Roosevelt. And this is a very famous painting called American Progress by a gentleman named John Gast. He painted it in 1872. And you can see in this picture, settlers are moving westward. You have the plains, you have the buffalo, they're on their wagons. You even have Native Americans moving westward. And, America is kind of symbolized in this virgin looking woman. She's got blonde hair, she's white. She kind of looks something like a Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty, and she's moving westward. She kind of portrays and symbolizes innocence. This is where Manifest Destiny is a little bit iffy because it wasn't always so innocent. So, this is a mentality that I just want to emphasize because I would actually say, even though it was coined in 1845, America has kind of had this mentality since its founding, and it still has it today. But to go back to also the industrial age, so now, spoken about the birth of industry. We start to have the growth of industry in the 1800s, early 1800s. We have new factories, new technologies. We have new people to help, work in these factories and use these new technologies and to settle this new land. But post Civil War, we start to turn a page, and we go into a new era. And Mark Twain, the writer, actually called this time period, and it's really from 1865 to 1900. Even I would even say you can go to 1929 for about a period of 60 years, from 1865 to 1929. We have a period called the Gilded Age. Gilded meaning it's like covered in gold. And this is a period, like its name, where America really starts to modernize, but it really starts to witness now a rise in wealth. This is where we start to get the 1% versus the 99%, which is still a phrase that we use today in terms of, unfortunately, in America, we still have large numbers of people, very wealthy people, millionaires and billionaires who own a lot of wealth in our country. I would say it's not as drastic as it is in Ukraine or Russia, but we still have a problem. We still have a gap between very, very wealthy and poor, and even not even just poor, middle class. But this is the period where it really starts to show. And we have these tycoons, these gentlemen, I hate to say it's gentlemen mostly, these men who become ridiculously and like grotesquely rich. They have enormous wealth. It's kind of disgusting, actually. And their wealth comes because they profit on industry. They take advantage of industry and America's growth. And they start to control large sectors of industry. They start to have monopolies. This is a big problem. We have Andrew Carnegie, who is a huge owner and producer in steel. We have John D. Rockefeller, who is oil and gas, and he starts to own railroads, actually. We have Cornelius Vanderbilt, a railroad owner. We have Herbert Dow, who is actually the creator of Dow Chemicals. Very important. You use a lot of chemicals in industries and factories. We also have J. Pierpont Morgan, who is later, his company becomes J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. He does steel and banking. And there are other tycoons, very, wealthy men and wealthy families. But these are kind of the famous ones that we think about, especially Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie. I would say those are the three big ones. And in fact, here is Rockefeller. He's depicted in a political cartoon, and he's wearing a crown with the money symbol on top. And he's kind of the king now, you know? He owns Standard Oil. And eventually, Rockefeller is a very good example, and he's a very popular example of monopoly, because Rockefeller, he started first selling snake oil, which is and it's kerosene oil. He sold oil for kerosene lamps, and later he starts to drill oil and produce oil in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. His famous company is called, I believe, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and he gets clever. He starts buying other businesses, and he starts buying his competitors out. He buys out railroads, and he starts to control them to ensure that his oil is moved and produced in the way that he wants. So he starts to own massive industries, predominantly railroads and oil. And he has a huge monopoly, and he becomes kind of a king. At this time, he becomes, especially towards the 1900s, he becomes one of the wealthiest men in America. And I think by 1932, he is the wealthiest man in America, and I think ever either. His company, Standard Oil, later becomes present day ExxonMobil, which is also one of the largest companies in America. I think it's the second after Walmart. So, a lot of these men built companies that we still use today. Anyway, so they're the first monopolies. But unfortunately, this is the 1%. What about the 99%? Especially those working in the factories. Well, this is the birth and the beginning of our industry. So we don't have a lot of laws in place. And in fact, we don't have anything in the Constitution that really talks about labor laws. Because industry didn't, as we know it today, didn't exist during the founding fathers' time. So labor laws don't exist. Protections certainly don't exist. Workers at this time had 10-hour shifts. This is post-war Civil War industry, America. Workers have to work 10 hours. They have to work 6 days a week, and they have very, very low wages. Children at this time could be hired as young as 8 years old. And you wanted children, remember, because they were small. They had smaller hands. They could work better with the machines, maybe. And they were low wage. You could pay them probably half what their parent would cost. And these children actually worked very long hours. Sometimes they didn't go to school. Retirement, medical coverage, disability, and unemployment benefits that we have today in America don't exist. There was no protections. Pregnant women could be fired without a reason. And usually the reason was they were pregnant. So it was a really bad time, to be honest, to be a worker in America at this time period. But to be honest, it didn't matter for some of these people, these workers, because it was still a job. And it was a big industry and a big employment sector for immigrants. A lot of the people that worked in these factories, like the glass factory, or even the coal mines, the steel mills, a lot of them were immigrants. My mom's grandfathers who came to America, they worked in coal mines, and they worked also in steel mills because it was the only place they could get hired. There was not only discrimination against Irish and German immigrants, there's discrimination against, to be honest, many immigrants, and including Italian immigrants. So this is one of the few places they could get hired, my mom's grandparents. They could go into these factories. So that's why they did it. There was some good that happened during this time period, but unfortunately, there was also a lot of bad. The effects of this industrial revolution, this birth of industry, especially during the Gilded Age, there are some good and there are some bad, kind of defects, what I call. First of all, the good is that, now you could produce more goods. You could have greater production, more goods. Things didn't have to be handcrafted anymore. You have what we call the birth of the assembly line, So, people could have more access and could buy goods. When you have a greater supply, you can usually decrease the price, right? And now it makes goods more accessible to people. Another big effect of this industrialization was urbanization. More and more Americans move to cities and they settle and they get jobs. This includes both native born Americans and immigrants. More people have money in their pockets, you know. Even though the wages were low, they were still wages. And so this leads to greater consumerism and a lot of mass market consumption. We had the birth of department stores, big stores where you could go shopping. And you have also the birth of the Levi jean. This is the famous jean from America. It was invented during this time period because a lot of factory workers needed clothing, especially pants that were durable. They were cheap. So Levi came up with the idea of sewing denim, which was a material from France. A guy named Levi Strauss, he came up with the idea of sewing denim together to create a pants. And he, made the right stitches, put the right pockets, and they became a hit. You know, they were a hit not only for factory workers, they were actually a hit also for farmers and for cowboys, ranchers. So they were a great success. Even today, they're a big success. And as I said before in the last slide, laws were slow to catch up. This included both labor laws, but also the laws controlling how people got rich, making sure that it was fair. There's nothing wrong with being rich. It's how did you become rich? Did you cheat people? Did you lie? Did you steal? We didn't have those laws back then that we have today for making sure people play fair, basically. So the gap between the rich and the poor grows. The number of millionaires in America goes from 20 to 3,000 in a period of 50 years. That's incredible, And unfortunately, that increase in wealth meant an increase in influence, especially in the government. Now you start to have wealthy industry owners going to senators and representatives, bribing them, schmoozing with them. So this is when we also have a big period of corruption in our government, unfortunately. The gap between the North and the South also grows in terms of economic wealth. These industries are all opening up in the Northeast. The factories are opening up. People are moving to the cities in the Northeast. The South, people are actually leaving. So unfortunately, while the North grows richer, the South kind of just stays stagnant. It doesn't really grow. It remains, even to today, largely agricultural. You have cities like New Orleans, Charleston, where I live in New Orleans, that are big cities, but we are nothing like compared to Philadelphia, New York, or Boston. And a lot of this has to do with the factories that open up. Banks and corporations in general become stronger. Corporations become strong because now they have more investors. They can get more money to grow, to expand. Banks are happy to give loans and investment to banks because they make money. When you have to pay a loan settlement, you have to pay an interest. And another big result of this is more Americans settle west, as I've said before. We have even more migration to the west, especially in the 1880s, 1890s. And of course, this just creates more and more conflict between Western settlers and Native Americans who were already pushed out west, even before the Civil War. And now they're going to be pushed out even more, or unfortunately, they're going to be killed. And really, the climax of this moment comes in the Battle of Wounded Knee, which was kind of seen as the last great battle in terms of a battle between Western settlers wanting to move in the area of Native American lands and Native Americans just trying to live, trying to defend themselves. It's kind of seen as the 1890s, kind of seen as the end of Native American expansion or growth. And it starts to begin the period of reservations and government intervention. And I just wanted to point this out too. I have here a logo of Levi Strauss, the famous Levi jeans. This is what they were famous for: the stitching, I know that sounds weird, but the stitching, the how it was sewn, it just made for very strong pants. Um, and it was founded in 1873. And this is the same logo that they used in 1873, they use still today. Um, and here is a Victorian era mansion. Um, this is the time period when you have some very wealthy Americans and they built some very, very luxurious homes. They were built in the style of the Victorian era, which is the era in England when Queen Victoria reigned. And I don't personally think they're pretty, but it doesn't matter. It's that they were massive homes. They were ornate, they were expensive, they were, some say beautiful. I mean, they weren't just a little, apartment building or like a nice simple home with one floor. I mean, I don't even know how many floors this is. This is like one, two, three, 3.5 floors. This is a famous one in California called the Carson Mansion. Um, so anyway, to move on, now we have the Gilded Age. We have our industries, they basically have blossomed. Our industries have blossomed, they've grown. And because of the defects, there are people who are like, hey, we want a, fair deal. Um, and so beginning in 1900, you start to have the era of what we call progressivism in America. A lot of Americans are fed up with that. There are so many people getting wealthy, industries are growing, but they're not being treated well. And we have one of the first progressive era presidents is Theodore Roosevelt. He becomes president in 1901. And he's really, I would say, the first major progressive president in terms of making progress for the average American. And he was just so affectionately known as Teddy Roosevelt. And this is where we actually get the name teddy bear, because Theodore Roosevelt loved nature, he loved parks. And so someone built a teddy bear and they named it Teddy after Theodore Roosevelt. So, but his nickname was Teddy. And Theodore Roosevelt was a very interesting gentleman. He kind of, I think he's interesting because he's respected by both Democrats and Republicans, but he's also not really respected by Democrats and Republicans today. People have mixed feelings for him, but I think generally he's looked well upon by Americans. He's also very famous. He had a larger than life personality, and he was later large. But he was one of the first major presidents, I would say, that really tried to stick up and fight for the common man. And he wanted to give what we call a square deal for everyone, which means everyone would get an equal deal. A square has equal sides. So everyone was going to be treated well and fairly. One person or one industry wasn't going to do better than the other. It needed to be equal. So he wasn't anti-business, he wasn't anti-industry, but he did put regulations. One of the first things he did was he passed the Food and Drug Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. And he later created actually the Federal Food and Drug Administration, which is present still today. Sure that the food and the chemicals and drugs that were being produced in America were produced correctly. And by trust, it's really a breakage of the big monopolies that had occurred. Oops, my connection. Okay. So anyway, he wanted to break up the monopolies that were growing and growing. So he passed an act to make sure that a business couldn't get too big. He was also a big advocate for nature and parks. He was a big outdoorsman. This is him when he was younger, 1885. He looks very different to when he did later, like 50 years later, But that's him when he was younger. He loved the outdoors, he loved hunting, but he also loved animals and nature. And he was a big advocate for parks, national parks. And so that was, his domestic policy. He wanted a square deal, and with his foreign policy, remember, he wanted to walk softly but carry a big stick. So he wanted to expand America's role in the world, but he wanted to make sure that it was with caution. We were going to step out into the world, get kind of out of our box, our isolationism that we had since George boldness. And as I said before, he believed that Latin America belonged in America's sphere, not Europe. Um, he expanded both the US Army and Navy, and he even mediated peace talks between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire after the Russo Japanese War. He was like the mediator. And this is actually a political cartoon of him with the Japanese emperor and the Russian czar here. So he was quite the personality. And he's very influential because this is, there are some presidents that really change how government, and he was one of those presidents. He was very influential in terms of expanding the role and responsibility of the government. And it doesn't just stop with him. The president after him, William Howard Taft, also is progressive. And the president after him is also progressive, Woodrow Wilson. All three of these men were progressive. They believe that America should be a little bit more intervening in world politics, and they also believe that the government should step in to protect average Americans. And we start to have a very big test in progressivism with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. When World War I broke out, America was not involved. America, since George Washington, has always been neutral. It didn't want to pick a side in terms of European affairs. And, to be honest, I understand why. If you pick a side, you end up, hurting another side. And we wanted to have good relations with all nations. But, unfortunately, the world doesn't really work that way, especially not during war. So, and I will say also, part of our isolationism and our position for neutrality, it also comes from our idea as kind of exceptional. This idea from Manifest Destiny that America was just needed to do its own thing. Let Europe deal with whatever it has to deal with. Let Asia deal with whatever it has to deal with. We're America. We will do our own thing. We'll take care of our own. We don't need to get involved. We're protected by oceans. We're far away. We don't need to get involved. So we have this mixture of feelings of isolationism, exceptionalism, and neutrality. And it's why we don't get involved in the war in the beginning. And initially, many Americans wanted to stay out of the war, even though Britain was our ally. We do consider England, even today, an ally. Part of the reason why is because so many Americans have German heritage, like my dad actually. But there are a lot of German Americans. And actually, I learned recently that the largest immigrant group in America, or the largest group that Americans claim their heritage from is Germany. I think we tend to think England, but actually it's German, or Germany, excuse me. But eventually, with World War One and the German aggression, I would say, especially in the waters, America couldn't be neutral. We had problems with Germany sinking our cargo ships that we were sailing from America to England. They would sink our cargo ships because it believed that Britain's waters was a war zone. It declared Britain's water borders a war zone. So if you brought a cargo to England, you were stepping on war territory. You weren't neutral. So that's how Germany justified sinking American ships. And, this really comes to a climax with the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a British ocean liner in May 1950. It was traveling from New York to Liverpool, and it had many passengers, some of whom were American. I think it was around 128 passengers or more. And they sunk this ocean liner. They destroyed it with their U-boats. They bombed it. And this was really a turning point for American sentiment because, for us, it was like, you're killing innocent lives. We're just neutral here. You're really being aggressive. But unfortunately, it took 2 years for Congress to declare war. We were very slow to finally get involved. Part of that has to do with the fact that we were still recovering from the Civil War. We still had that memory in us, but also we needed to modernize our military. We needed to get our forces ready. We needed to get our weapons ready. We just weren't prepared. Um, and once we did declare war, we did have our famous propaganda. This is actually where I say this is the most famous American war poster. This is the famous Uncle Sam pointing at an individual, and it says, "I want you," for the US Army. This actually came in 1970 for World War One. I didn't even realize that, but it's very famous. You'll still see it almost today, kind of, modernized. This was also another propaganda poster. This is from the US Army trying to encourage people to join in the cause. And it did have anti German sentiment. Um, Destroy this mad brute. And the mad brute is a German dressed up as a monkey, like an uncivilized creature. And it's Germany because he has a military hat that's in the German army, and he has a little mustache. It's supposed to be Kaiser Wilhelm. And it has a club that says culture, that the Germans are trying to bring culture. But here he is grabbing an innocent woman who's supposed to represent America. So it's obviously racist, but it's war. It was a way for people to feel emotionally attached to the cause. I would say that during this time period, World War One is really an exceptional time in America. Part of the reason why is because it's the first time we really get involved in a cause that's global. We get out of our isolationism shell, this protection of isolationism and neutrality, and we get out of it. It's exceptional. It's also exceptional because afterwards we go back to isolationism. It's also exceptional because, as you all know, World War One was extremely bloody. It was the first major world war. It had modernized weapons, which were awful to its victims. We also had the Spanish flu during this time period, which affected a lot of soldiers and people. So, but anyway, in terms of the United States, it takes a while, as I said, and finally, on April 6th, 1917, excuse me, 3 years after the war begins, we finally drafted. So, even though we came late, I think, we weren't a small force. We still had 5 million. Oops, my internet connection. We still had 5 million Americans who died and sacrificed their lives. I know it's not the same as like the Russian Empire or even the German Empire, the French, the British, but it's sizable for us. This was still, this was very large size for us. Not as large as the Civil War, but still very important. Innocent lives were lost. Um, our involvement in the war was very brief, but I would say it was very timely. It came at a good time. Um, Actually, it came because, in some ways, the Russian Revolution ended, and Russia, as you know, the Russian Empire withdrew from the war. It had to. It was going through its own civil turmoil, as you all know. So that was very advantageous for Germany because then they can turn their efforts to Western Europe. They didn't have to think about Eastern Europe. Okay, we can focus on Western Europe. So luckily, in some ways, the U.S. did come because after 3 years of fighting, Western European troops, especially the British and the French, they're tired. They're worn out. They've used many of their good men, their good weapons. So the American arms and troops added much needed help and reprieve for the Allied powers. So even though we came late, I say, we came at a very good time. We came at the right time in some ways. We were very helpful. Yeah, I think this helped to turn the tide of the war, actually. And um, we weren't involved in the war for long. The peace treaty was signed in 1919, but even President Woodrow Wilson could kind of see the end in sight in January of 1918. He started to see the end of the war. And he actually makes a very famous speech. It's called the 14-point speech now. But he outlined his vision for peace for Europe and America, especially for Europe after World War One. He had 14 points for peace. And in this 14 points for peace, he advocates for kind of European unity. He advocates for a League of Nations. He really believes that one of the reasons why the war broke out is because Europeans couldn't agree, they couldn't communicate. This was a big problem, and it has worldwide effects. So he wanted a League of Nations, and that's important because that's actually the precursor to the United Nations. His speech was idealistic, it was, and it kind of ticked off a lot of Allied powers. It called for policies such as returning territories that were conquered during the war. He advocated to return them back to the original empires. And the Allies were like, no. They were kind of ticked off. They wanted Germany to honestly suffer, to be punished. Whatever you think of that, it's what they thought. They felt like Germany needed to make sure it learned its lesson, so to speak. So the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919, but it did not follow Wilson's points. It didn't even have it had the League of Nations, but it was kind of a forethought. It didn't have much meat to it. And this is a president, just so you know, this is what President Woodrow Wilson looked like. And this is just a small excerpt from the speech I'll read. This is what he kind of believed. And you can see how this was kind of idealistic. He said, "The world must be safe for every peace-loving nation, which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealing by the other peoples of the world, as against force and selfish aggression." And if you notice here, he says, every people must respect nations who want to live their own life, basically determine their own institutions. So even though he eventually declared war, he made sure America was involved. His speech is actually kind of advocating for isolationism again. He basically wants people to just be peaceful, and let nations do their own thing, and if we have a League of Nations, it's to make sure that people can determine their own fate. So he's actually going back to isolationism. This is why I say that World War I was really an exceptional time, because afterwards we go back to isolationism, to our previous positions. But you know what? I'll be honest, like World War II, World War I made sure that the world would never be the same. So after World War I ends in 1919, we have the 1920s. And in the 1920s, especially in America, because we were far away, we weren't really affected by the war, we had even greater industrialization, we had greater consumerism, urbanization. We came out well from the war, in part because we came late into the war. So, we have this great feeling of optimism, rejuvenation, so to speak. We have great consumerism. Cinemas start to open up, a lot of them. We have this birth of the silent film industry, or the film industry. This is Charlie Chaplin's The Kid, very famous. And, lots of Americans are going to cinemas. They're also buying cars. The cars are replacing the buggy on the streets. No one wants to go in a horse-drawn carriage. Women in particularly are feeling more liberated. They're feeling very excited. The 19th Amendment just passed, and the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920. And so this kind of creates a feeling of, I have more freedoms, I have more liberty. Even though, we might say it's just the right to vote, it's this idea that women are slowly being viewed and treated as equal. Uh, Also, women and Americans in general, they continue to move and work in cities. Education is actually becoming more accessible. The era of progressivism started to create more schools for students and children. It granted more access for education, which was important. We start to have literacy in our country. Um, However, this is maybe what's a little strange. Even though we have this feeling of optimism and growth, Americans actually want to go back to kind of isolationism too. And they start to want to decrease the role of the government in terms of domestic and foreign affairs. Americans are starting to see that the era of progressivism, it became a little bit too much, and it really hit its peak with World War One. So we start to have kind of a decade of conservatism, which is where in conservatism, in the sense that we're starting to decrease our excesses and our big role in government. Um, and it's trying to take control of this era of consumerism and urbanization. And one thing that kind of symbolizes this conservatism is the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the sale of alcohol. It doesn't prohibit the consumption or drinking of alcohol, but the sale. This was passed also actually during the same year as the 19th Amendment. Um, but unfortunately, a lot of Americans are not going to stop selling alcohol. In some ways, this was a terrible idea because it brought the rise in black market activity and, of course, the famous mafia, Al Capone. You know, if you want to watch a good movie about the 1920s, I recommend Some Like It Hot. It's very good. It was filmed in 1959, but it's set in the 1920s. So, anyway, we start to now have, after the progressives, we have the conservatives, basically. Um, but even with conservative policies, we still have large growth of American manufacturing. They call it the roaring 20s. I'm going to call it the soaring 20s because American consumerism and manufacturing just grows. And just so you know, these are the three famous presidents during this era. In order, we have Presidents Harding, Hoover, and Coolidge. These three presidents are kind of the famous conservative presidents during this time period. And to be honest, unfortunately, their conservatism has a negative effect, I would say. And I'll explain that. So we have conservatism, but we still have large businesses. Conservatism doesn't mean you're against business and business activity. You want to mainly conserve government regulation, actually, and government intervention. And after the war, government intervention and restrictions end, really. And so manufacturing, as I said, grows. Agriculture actually remains stagnant. This is when agriculture doesn't really grow because more and more Americans are moving to cities. And it really, oh, sorry, guys, I made a mistake here. This is, oops, this is wrong. Oops, I don't know how to edit this. Let me edit this. I got the wrong year here. Sorry, guys, I should have read this. From 1920 to 1930 alone, not the 1820s, but the 1920s, from this decade alone, American car ownership grew from 8 million to 23 million. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's massive. It's just a great fact of showing how more and more Americans are buying, but more and more factories are producing. And here we have Henry Ford's famous Model T. This was the car that was invented in 1909 it was the first car that could be assembled in a factory. You didn't need unique little parts. It was a factory made car. And it was popular for, I think, like 25 years. I think it was in production from 1909 to 1927, a very long time. And it's not just cars Americans are buying. We have radios, we have refrigerators, washing machines. These are hit items, popular items. And they're very important too because they made American women's lives easier. so they could go out and work more. They could engage in more leisure activities. So, the 1920s, were very big for women's rights and women's liberation. Not quite as big as the 1960s, but this is kind of the start. However, not everything is bright and cheery, unfortunately. We have this increase in manufacturing and businesses, but as a result, we have increased speculation. We have people who think, oh, these businesses keep growing and growing. I'm going to invest even more stocks. And there comes a point where a business can only grow so much. There's not enough demand. Even though Americans are growing in terms of population, even though we have more immigrants, there comes a point where the bubbles burst. And there comes a problem of excessive speculation. We have businesses that are being overvalued. People think they're going to grow when they're not. And the stock market prices are going up, up, up. Eventually, they have to come down. And it comes crashing down at the end of the decade. In some ways, rightfully so. Unfortunately, I'm not thinking about this in a good way. This is awful. But eventually it comes crashing down. And literally the market crashes. The market collapses. Finally, there comes a point where investors are like, oh God, we're actually not going to grow this well. Or, you know what? I think this company is actually overvalued. I think there's too much value in this company. So investors panic and they sell their shares. And it hits a turning point on October 29th, 1929. We have the stocks, they plummet so low because so many investors are pulling out and the market collapses. And we call this Black Tuesday, actually, Tuesday, October 29th. And this is really the event that starts the Great Depression. I call it, unfortunately, the perfect depression because all the right things happen to create a depression in our country. The stock market itself didn't create the depression, but it kind of started it. It kind of spurred it. But there were other factors in place. Part of that is the fact that Europe is still recovering from the war. And this is, why this was such a shocking thing in American history is because before the crash, the stock market crashed, America had the strongest economy in the world. It was doing really well, even compared to Europe and Asia. But afterwards, it hits its low, along with Europe. The thing about this Great Depression is it wasn't just in America. It was in Asia and Europe, especially in Europe. And many people say it's one of the reasons why we had Nazi Germany rise to power. So anyway, and I just want to point this out to you. This is actually Black Tuesday. This is when the markets dip. But with something that I didn't even realize, the stock market didn't just dip that one day. It continued to decrease and decrease and decrease. I mean, in the 1930s, you have the lowest, stock market prices, the Dow Jones. It's an average of stock market shares. So this just kept getting worse. It wasn't like it was one period that hit an all-time low. One day was terrible. It was a whole decade. And what made the Depression last, what made it almost the perfect storm for a depression, were several reasons. First of all, as I said, agricultural production remained kind of stagnant. Unlike manufacturing, it wasn't really growing. It was still producing, but it wasn't growing. And part of its lack of growth is the fact that there was decreased demand from Europe. Europe just couldn't afford to import our agriculture. There is a decrease in US population growth too, actually. Businesses kept expanding. This is part of speculation. Businesses kept expanding, but even though they were producing more, we weren't necessarily buying more. We did have a lot of consumerism, but businesses were producing more than we could buy. So you have an oversupply. The battle between the 1% and 99% just got even bigger. It got stronger. These 1%ers, these millionaires who would now be billionaires today, they didn't share their wealth. They tended actually to keep it in their families, to themselves. Trickle down economics of sharing it with the poor did not exist. So this just made wealth wasn't being distributed equally. Um, Middle class Americans, which are considered even today the backbone of our economy, middle class Americans, they had already pushed their credit to the max. They didn't have any more money. They didn't have savings. They actually had loans and credit to pay off because this is the era of consumerism. They wanted to buy new goods. They wanted to buy cars. So middle class Americans especially didn't have money to fall back on. They didn't have savings. It's another reason why the depression was so hard. Uh, and lastly, too, there was little government oversight on banks and their investors and lending. This is the decade of conservatism when the presidents want to bring back federal government oversight. And this unfortunately had unintended consequences because now businesses and banks are kind of being allowed to do whatever they want. There's no government, oversight. So that's kind of why we have this Great Depression. All the right things lined up to make it awful, unfortunately. And the Great Depression, or what I call the Long Depression, it lasted 10 years. It was a really long time. Um, I can't even fathom it, to be honest. I can't imagine being, having no savings, no unemployment. I mean, no employment. Um, I don't know how we got through it, to be honest. And to be honest, I would even say it took a world war to end it. Um, Presidents tried different ways to get out of the depression, but really World War II, excuse me, was the war that helped America, at least, and probably parts of Europe, to get out of the depression. Um, and what made it so difficult is banks lost money from their investments because the stock market crashed. They lost money. They became even more conservative to lend money. They stopped lending money actually to businesses. And you need some loans if you're a business to help grow your business, to start your business. And when the banks cut their lending, businesses then cut their production and their labor force. So you have major unemployment. You have more and more people unemployed. It was terrible. And by 1933, 15 million Americans are unemployed. They don't have a job. It's not even that they have a part-time job, it's that they have no job. And this is about 20% of the workforce population, 20% of our population that can work. Right now, we have large unemployment. It's about to reach 30 million because of COVID-19. That's a pretty high number, but it represents maybe about 15 or 16% of our workforce population. It's not quite the same percentage as the Great Depression, but unfortunately, it's getting there. And by 1933, half of the banks close. It's devastating because then people lose their money. Banks at this time had people's money, but they didn't have to give back their customers' money. They had no insurance. Now today, if a bank goes under and it has your money, you are guaranteed by the government to have at least, I believe, 150,000 from the bank. And this law comes from the Great Depression when banks closed, and not only did they close, their customers' account closed, and they weren't going to give that money back. So people's life savings were lost. It's terrible. And one of the results of this, decrease in employment, decrease in business, it meant a decrease in wages, of course. And this means a decrease in consumer spending and even spending on food. And this affected farmers who are already having a difficult time. Farmers suffered because now people don't want as much food. The demand isn't there. And what made it really difficult for farmers is we had a dust bowl in 1930. This was a severe dust storm that destroyed crops and animals all across the Midwest, which is basically the middle of America. It destroyed our agriculture basically, and it just made life more difficult. The famous book Grapes of Wrath, is about the Dust Bowl. Um, it's a famous American novel by John Steinbeck. And what made it even worse, as I said, is our government was conservative at this time when it probably shouldn't have been. President Hoover, who is the president during the start of the Great Depression, um, he tries to give out loans to businesses, but he can't keep up. Congress can't keep up with how many businesses are being shut down. But also, President Hoover didn't really believe that the government should be meddling in businesses' affairs. And he certainly didn't believe that the government had a duty or even a right to give unemployment help. Luckily, right now, during this COVID-19, our government is giving us some funding to help businesses and to help individuals, money. Um, that wasn't there in the 1929, Great Depression start. So this just probably made the Depression even worse. Um, and by 1933, which is still within the Great Depression, and about 10 years until America enters World War II, we start to have a very familiar face. Well, not familiar face, familiar name come up. Americans are not going to put up with conservatism. They had it for 10 years, and it proved to be a failure, to be honest, with President Hoover. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was a Democrat. He promised to the American people that he was going to give them a new deal in terms of he and Congress work together, work hard to make sure that America could recover. This was part of his election campaign. So he ran on the promise of a new deal, kind of similar to a square deal, which his fifth cousin, so he's related to Theodore Roosevelt, it's his fifth cousin. And like his cousin, Franklin was going to make sure that everyone was going to get a square deal, a new deal, though, one that would really help all Americans, especially the poor and middle class and farmers as well. So this isn't the end of the Depression, but this is kind of a turning point when slowly Americans start to become more optimistic. And FDR is very important because, unlike the other presidents, Hoover, Coolidge, and Harding, he was very optimistic in a time when it was very depressing. And he reassured to the American people when he was inaugurated, when he was saying his speech for his presidential beginnings, when he gave a speech, he reassured to the American people that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It's a very famous line in his speech. And he was trying to reassure to Americans, I know we're in a tough time, but we're going to get through this. And he's very important because he is the president that leads America through World War II. And he is also the only president who was elected 4 times, which is an exception. But this is where I'm going to end my PowerPoint, because now we're going to get into the era of Roosevelt and his New Deal. And then we're going to enter World War II, and then the Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War. So this is where I will end my lecture today. I want to thank you all for joining me. Our next lecture will be May 19th, 2020. Well, 2020, excuse me. May 19th, which is, I think, in 2 weeks, we'll cover these topics next. Basically, how does America get out of this awful time period? And what effects does it have on World War II? And then we have the Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War. And I just wanted to share with you all this funny cartoon. I wanted to share with you all because it's kind of like modern day immigration mentality. We've lost control of our borders. They must be rounded up and deported. This is what some people who are maybe more, they want stronger immigration laws and controls. You'll often hear this, people are coming into our borders. It's uncontrollable. They're coming in here illegally. But then the cartoon shows that it's actually Native Americans speaking on behalf of Americans. So I thought it was funny, kind of brings the circle back around, So thank you all for joining me. Let me just see what our chat says. I'm sorry, guys. I forget how the chat works. Where is it? Da, da, da. Hold on. Sorry, guys. I forget how the chat works. There we go. Chat. Here we go. Okay. Let me just answer some of your questions. What tests do you have to pass to be? Oh, sorry. I'm covering up the slide. This is first question. What test do you have to pass to become a citizen in America? Is it a history test or something? Actually, yes. It's part history, part knowledge of how American government works. It's a very important test, and you actually have to know a level of English. You have to know at least intermediate English to do well on the test. That's not to say you can't pass the test if you have beginner English, but it's much harder because you have to answer the test orally, the questions orally. It's an oral test, so it's not easy, and you have to know both American history and American government. Thank you for the lecture. Have a question. This is number 2. Why do states have such straight borders? Oh, good point. Well, part of America, especially the East Coast, we don't have straight borders. The East Coast and parts of the South don't have straight borders because when Europeans were first settling into America, the boundaries were based on, rivers, on mountain ranges. So they're irregular because of that. We start to have straight borders, especially in the West, because when America was creating those states, instead of drawing it based on land or rivers or, mountain ranges, they just made an easy square and said, this is going to be Colorado. And actually, one of the reasons why settlement towards the West was so popular is because the American government itself offered to give away land for free if Americans would settle into those states. It was kind of like one of those things like the land came before the demand. The government wanted Americans to move out west because it would mean more control. It wanted Americans to move out west. So they carved out squares of the states and said, this is going to be Colorado. It's going to be this square block. Utah is here. And then it offered for a long time those lands for free. It was called the Homestead Act. If you, as a settler, as a farmer, come to this land, you cultivate it, you own it. This goes all the way back to John Locke, who said ownership is by cultivation and settlement. And Americans believe that, especially the government. So, good question. Number 3, the Industrial Revolution was slower than the one in England. So not that many people lost their jobs, right? Sorry, I didn't catch that. Oh, that's true, actually. Good point. So we were slower in the sense that, England started to have its Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. In the 1700s. It really grows and peaks in the 1800s during the Victorian era. In America, we start our industrial movement in the early 1800s and we peak in the 1900s. But actually, a lot of people didn't lose their jobs because industries are growing. In fact, we had to get more people to get the jobs. Like we encouraged even more immigration because we had such a growth in industry and factories. There came a point, though, of course, where industry was so big, especially in the 1900s, where there was actually too many people and not enough jobs. There does come a point where, the balance tips, where you have too little people and too much factories. And so you need more people and you have more job opportunities. But then starting in the 1920s, especially, the balance tips when you have too much industry, too much manufacturing, you don't have enough people. And that's one of the reasons why we had a Great Depression. It's also, though, why we have unemployment is because so many industries also collapsed during the Great Depression. Okay, number 4, if child's parents are not citizens of US, but he or she was born on this land, would this child be a citizen? Yes. Yes, yes, yes. It doesn't matter if your parents, your grandparents were not citizens. If you are born in America, you are automatically granted citizenship. I think this is actually the same thing in Russia. I don't know about Ukraine, because I know that because I was born in Russia, I actually have Russian citizenship because I was born there. And like US citizenship, if you get another citizenship, say you move to Italy and you have Italian citizenship, you still keep your American citizenship. It doesn't go away. But this is also one of the reasons why a lot of, I don't know how to call them, like people who are for strong immigration controls, they don't like the fact that they think that a lot of Americans, a lot of immigrants come to this country just to have their child in, just to have their child as a citizen, and then they can stay. Um, because once your child is born in America, and even though you're not a citizen, or maybe you might be an illegal immigrant, generally speaking, the American government is not going to separate you from your child. Now, that's been an issue because actually, under the Trump administration, he did start to separate children from their parents, both at the border, but also he wanted to separate dreamers at first. Dreamers are young Americans who actually they weren't even born in America. They were born in another country with their parents, and they were brought to America when they were young by their parents. But anyway, Trump wanted to separate them. So it's been kind of a growing feeling among some Americans to stop using this rule. You know, they don't like the fact that people are kind of taking advantage of this rule. There are women, to be honest, who do come to America, who do have a child in America, just so then they can try to get citizenship for themselves and their child. So it is what it does happen. But generally speaking, you know, this is how I feel about immigration. People don't come to this country, uh, you know, for evil reasons. They're already struggling. They're already, you know, having difficulties in their country. They're just trying to have a better time, trying to create more opportunity for themselves and their children. I think the average immigrant that comes to our country has good intentions, whether they're illegal or not. Um, I don't know why we tend to focus on illegal immigrants, which I think is honestly unfair. Personally, this is my personal opinion. Number five, is it because of mass migration America became that tolerant to other religions? Yeah, actually. Well, also it has to do with our 13 colonies, actually, all the way to the 1600s. You know, New England was kind of founded for pilgrims and Puritans, but other states wanted to also have religious freedom. Pennsylvania was actually one of the most religiously tolerant states. It was founded actually so that other people of different faiths and religion could practice. Um, so I would say we are actually generally tolerant of other religions. We have a little bit of Islamophobia now because of, you know, September 11th and you know, the rise in Islamic based terrorism. But generally, I think we are tolerant of other religions, even if we are a majority Christian nation. So do you know why there are so many Mexican immigrants? No, I actually don't, to be honest. Maybe this is something I will try to touch up on, not next lecture, but lecture number 6, when I will do the late part of the 20th century. But I know Mexico has a very complicated history. And like other nations, it has periods of economic depressions, economic problems, especially in the 1900s. Um, so that is one of the reasons why so many Mexicans come to America to settle or even just to work. There are not just Mexicans who immigrate to America. There are Mexicans who work in America and then go back. Um, Another reason why we have so many Mexicans is because it's right next door. You know, it's an easy border to cross. Maybe not now, but it's right next door. So hi, what made you conducting lectures for Ukrainians? Where do you search for materials for lectures? Number 7. Okay, so why am I doing these lecture series? Well, I wanted to do these lecture series because I just thought maybe there are some people who want to learn American history. Um, to be honest, I had the same feelings for Ukrainian history. I kind of wish I had taken a class on Ukrainian history. Uh, for those who don't know, I actually was teaching in Ukraine for about 7 months. I arrived in September last year, but I had to leave in March of this year because of COVID. And, you know, I always kind of wish I took in a Ukrainian history class. And I thought, well, maybe there are some Ukrainians who wish they took an American history class, you know? And because America does have such an important role in our country, in our world, excuse me, because it's so influential, I think it's always good to study a country's history to kind of understand where they're coming from. But also because I believe that the past is never dead, it is never past. History is alive, it's never dead. And I just thought also, America, um, it's popular in television and in movies. A lot of my students that I taught watched American movies and TV shows, but I don't think a lot of them knew about the history or really knew about much about like America itself. So I also wanted to try to teach American history to try to erase some stereotypes that maybe people have of Americans. Um, and where do I get most of my information? I'll be honest, I'm just a big history nerd. I remember history well. I love history. So a lot of it comes from my head. But I do also look online just to help get facts, help to recall some of my history classes, some of my history notes. Um, Maybe I'll share with you. There are two websites that I use that are really helpful for me for learning and remembering American history. So I'll share them with you at the end of my last lecture. I'll share with you some resources. Okay, number 8. What do Americans think about not very good ideological invasions? Oh gosh. So, I would say it's only become the past few decades is when America, I think, is really reassessing its role in the world. And even today, we're still debating what is America's role in the world? Are we a policeman? Should we be a policeman? Um, and, unfortunately, I think Ukraine is actually a good example. And I say unfortunately because I think it comes at a cost to Ukrainians. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and it took over Crimea and then it took over parts of eastern Ukraine, America didn't invade. America didn't attack. Even though there is actually a promise under the Minsk agreement in 1993, I think it was an agreement between America, and Ukraine that if Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons and arms, America and Russia would protect it if it was to be invaded. This is actually an agreement we made, and it was active, so to speak, in 2014. We never signed away from it. Um, and we made this agreement because Ukraine at the time, I believe, had the largest number of nuclear arms and weapons. They were stored in Ukraine. It had a lot of them. The Soviet Union kept a lot of weapons in Ukraine, and America wanted to make sure that they didn't fall into the wrong hands, that they were secure. So they made Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons, which I think was kind of a mistake in my opinion. And in return, America promised to protect Ukraine if anybody would invade it. And in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, and we didn't do anything. And unfortunately, I think the reason why we didn't do anything, part of it is because Americans and even our leaders don't really know how America should be. Like, what is America's role right now? Because if we actually then went into Ukraine and fought Russia, first of all, might we have a nuclear war? That's scary. We don't want a nuclear war. You're going to have two big world powers fighting in Ukraine who have nuclear weapons. That's scary. But there is also this idea of like, if we were to go into Ukraine and fight in Ukraine, might we cause more problems for Ukraine? Kind of honestly how we did for Iraq. We invaded Iraq, we invaded Afghanistan, And I don't know if those countries really are much better off because we invaded them. Maybe, maybe not. I don't think you can say that for Iraq. Iraq now has, it had a movement of ISIS. It's very destabilized. We got rid of Saddam Hussein, but now there hasn't really been a leader. And Iraq is just as poor as it was before, I think. So, I think there's a debate, a division in our country of, should America invade, when a country needs help, like Ukraine, or should it step back and help it in different ways, maybe? Because in the past, we have invaded countries, not just Iraq and Afghanistan. We invaded Guatemala, we invaded Nicaragua. Uh, we intervened in countries when it wasn't really appropriate, and we probably made situations in countries worse. So, and now, I mean, I'm grateful that now our country still wants to help Ukraine. It still wants to give aid. It still wants to give military help. Thank God. But I don't know. I don't know what America's role should be in Ukraine. This is both a debate for Ukrainians and Americans. So I don't know. But it comes at a cost because now we have this Russian invasion in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, and due to our lack of movement, probably our lack of invasion or military action, who knows how long this will last. Maybe Russia can now stay in Ukraine longer than it thought it could. I don't know. It's hard. um, I'll think about that. And lastly, another question, excuse me. Number 10, were there few jobs and many unemployed people, or they just didn't want to hire immigrants? Very good point. So there was a mixture, actually. It's both. There were some industries, like the railroad industry, like the steel factories, like the glass factories and other industries. They were fine with hiring immigrants because usually you could take advantage of immigrants. Some of them didn't speak English, um, which means you can take advantage of them. Some of them didn't care if they were paid a lower wage than a citizen. And you could pay them lower wages, you could kind of take advantage of their position. So some factories and industries wanted immigrants. Some of them did not. Some factories literally said, no Irish need not apply, or Irish need not apply. They didn't want the Irish. They thought they were dirty. They thought they were gross. They didn't want to ruin their products, their factories. Uh, Jews had a hard time getting employment. Italians had a hard time getting employment, Chinese, so it's actually kind of 50-50. Part of the unemployment was because of xenophobia, fear of immigrants, nativism. But part of it was that people just wanted only to hire citizens. So, okay. Last question. What is the percentage now? 3% versus 97%. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe. I think it is 3%, 97%. Certainly there are more and more wealthy Americans today than there was in 1920, 1870. But we still have this very upper class in America that own an enormous amount of wealth and assets in America. I need to look up the percentage, but I heard there was something like 1% of America owns, it's like 30% of America. Like it's disgusting how so much wealth and control is concentrated in this small group of people that have a lot of influence and that have a lot of money. And to be honest, these tycoons like Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, they, back then they were in the oil industry, in the railroad industry. I would honestly say today they're in the tech industry. The people who are doing very well in our country and who are becoming more powerful are business owners, technology owners. Apple, Steve Jobs was very wealthy, very influential, powerful. Even today, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, is very influential, I would say. Mark Zuckerberg has a lot of influence and money, very wealthy. You have Google. And maybe the concentration is not so much in one person in terms of wealth, but these companies are just as powerful as the companies in the past. And honestly, I think they're becoming like monopolies, like Facebook. I think they own Instagram, they own YouTube, they own WhatsApp. Amazon is competing against all its competitors, it's buying out its competitors. Google, Microsoft, these are kind of the modern day tycoons and the modern day monopolies. And to be honest, I don't really understand how they're getting away with some of the things that they are. Part of it has to do with the fact that we as Americans are so reliant on our technology that we don't want to disrupt their industries, their production. Another reason is because they still have influence in government. Um, but luckily, more and more Americans are critical to these companies. It's not that we want to get rid of these companies, but we're more and more critical of how much power they have. So, but there's still a gap between rich and poor. Um, Now, in America, I would say we still have a bigger, unlike Ukraine and maybe Russia, we have a smaller middle class than we did before, but we still have one. And we have still a pretty strong upper middle class or upper class. They're not 1%, but we still have a pretty layered level of economic wealth. But the one percenters still have a lot more influence and power and a lot more money. So, okay, guys, that was it. These were all your questions. I know this was a very long lecture, but we covered a lot. We covered industry, we covered immigration, we covered the Gilded Age, the Great Depression, World War One, and we're going to cover even more. But we're really going to focus in the period of like 2 to 3 decades. World War II, as you know, is massive. I know you'll be celebrating Victory Day, maybe next weekend, Friday, Saturday. World War II is important in Soviet history. It's important in American history. And it brings on, unfortunately, the Cold War, which is also very important, especially for US, Russian, and Soviet relations. So thank you all. I appreciate it. I hope you all have a wonderful day, wonderful week, and I will, see you next time, May 19th, okay? Keep in touch. Thank you.